thanks for having me. The title, IP Geofeeds, Trust, Accuracy, and Abuse. And this was done with colleagues, my other colleagues at IPinfo, Oliver and William. So I won't belabor the point, as the previous talk talked about why we would use IP geolocation, where geofeeds come in. But the question that we're trying to answer today is, how accurate are the geofeeds that are being provided, and can we trust them? So just a quick primer. So we've got the RFCs out here. 8805 tells you about how to publish a geofeed, how to write one. And then 9632 and 9877 is how do you fetch geofeeds and optionally authenticate them. And I put great emphasis on optionally because as far as I know, I don't think anyone authenticates their or provides any form of authentication for their geofeeds. So in general, geofeed adoption is growing. In 2020, when the RFC was published, Google was processing about 400 feeds of 750,000 prefixes. And then several research papers afterwards sort of found that a small minority of the allocated IPv4 space is actually covered by geofeeds. But it's growing. So our recent study in 2025 over at IPinfo, we're processing roughly almost 800,000 geofeeds. And this includes at IPinfo, we get private geofeeds as well that people send to us. So that number might be an overcount of what's public. There's this great website, Geolocate Much, that sort of shows about, hey, what are the geofeeds out there, and the reactivity of geofeeds, right? So you can see all the different IP geolocation providers and how fast they process the geofeeds and so on. This little chart here shows the growth for about 10 months. So from December 2024 up until September 2025, we're processing about 3,300 geofeeds from 7,300 Whois organizations, and again, the 457,000 IPv4 prefixes and 324,000 IPv6 prefixes. So how do we get a geofeed? So first, we can do it via Whois. So here I can query a subnet, and in the comment, it says, here's a geofeed along with a URL endpoint. So this is the example from RFC 8805, the top part at least, where this, geofeeds can be timely, right? They could say, okay, for IETF 106, this is where the geolocation information for these IP subnets. And what we have here is when you process a geofeed, you have to do longest prefix matching. So the example A at the bottom, I might have a more specific prefix that says, hey, for this /24, don't geolocate. There's no geolocation information, so you shouldn't try to geolocate this to Singapore. So that's, sorry, I went ahead of myself. So you can specify that there should be no geolocation information for specific subnets. Now, given a geofeed, can you trust them? Because they aren't always in Whois. The geofeeds have typos, mistakes, encoding issues, and we found a couple adversarial geofeeds, either for fun or for profit. And I'll go over those examples later on in the slide. But we did a study, and we found that 17 of the 20 popular VPN providers will exit from a different country than actually claimed. And this was a study that was published in December 2025. So as one example for a potential adversarial VPN location, this particular IP address is advertising a certain IP that we've verified or validated to be not in that location. So first we'll take a look and say, okay, where is this IP address? So we might look up in the Whois database, they have a geofeed. And then we look at the CSV file and we find, okay, they're saying that it's in Port Louis, Mauritius, and is it actually in that place? So we can validate, for example, using ping, and I've selected a bunch of different vantage points from around the world. And in green, the green color means the response time is lower, and in red, the response time is higher. So I have on the bottom right where the claimed location for that IP address, and we can see that from an IP in London that the RTT is quite low. And in fact, it's impossibly low because at a distance of 6,000 miles straight line, we would expect it to be roughly 48 milliseconds at a minimum. So this sort of indicates to us that this IP address is not actually in Port Louis. So we can evaluate the geofeed accuracy via active measurements. So in our process, we geolocate IPs using RTT measurements using our ProbeNet. We can build an RTT polygon for each IP using multilateration, and then we'll check the intersection. Does it match the country or the city that it's claimed in? So in our data set, we have roughly 28 million RTTs covering 205,000 IPv4 prefixes and around 75,000 IPv6 prefixes. So as an example of multilateration, so here I'm using ping.sx, where I can ping a target IP address, and I'll take the best RTT, and I can create polygons using the speed of light or an approximation of speed of light in fiber, and I'll generate these circles, and the red shows the sort of the approximation of where we think that IP address could be. And the goal here is not to show that, oh, this IP address is in this giant red circle here to precisely identify where this IP address is, but to show that it's definitely not in Port Louis, Mauritius, right? So we're sort of, it's not consistent with the RTTs that we're seeing that this IP address is actually in Port Louis. So we do that using our ProbeNet, roughly 1,300 probes, 500 cities, 143 countries, and 400 ASs. I think that number's been updated. I think we have more, but this is what's on the slide. And we'll evaluate all the IP prefixes in our geofeeds. And so what we found is that at a country level, about 92% consistency. So the countries are consistent with the RTT measurements that are being that we've measured. And at a city level, it's about 79.6% consistency. And then the median mismatch between the geofeed entry location and the and what we're measuring is roughly 472 miles. So the takeaway here is that the RTT measurements provide good coverage of geofeeds, and we can evaluate with good accuracy whether or not the geofeeds are accurate or not. We find that a lot of the top mismatching geofeeds come from CDNs, tier 1 networks, hosting and security providers, and IP leasing brokers. So oftentimes, some geofeeds might have quite a large subnet. They might be covering a /16, a /17, and so if they're leasing out those IPs or a customer is using those IPs, there might not be an associated geofeed entry for that specific subnet. But overall, we find that there's a mismatch between the user and infrastructure geolocation, as the previous speaker talked about, where where the user is quite different from where the traffic is egressing from. So for example, iCloud Private Relay, Cloudflare Warp, and a bunch of other VPN services. We also decided to look at the geofeed accuracy on mobile networks. So we'll geolocate IP and device using our mobile app. So we have the ground truth of the device's GPS location. And we also have the connection information. Are they connecting to cellular, Wi-Fi, VPN? And then we'll do the same thing. We'll match whether or not the GPS matches the country or city. In this case, our sample size is quite smaller, 169 devices, 24 countries, 196 cities, and fewer prefixes. So this is sort of more of a case study rather than a complete representation of all the mobile networks. So at the country level, we find roughly 85% consistency. 89% IPv4, 82.4% IPv6. And at a city level, this is where the consistency really drops to about roughly 30%. So at a city level, the geolocation the device geolocation really does not match what the geofeed is saying. And so we have the CDS of 90th percentile. So you can see in what's labeled, all the numbers are labeled the 90th percentile. So the red line shows if there's no country, if the country doesn't match and the city doesn't match, so the distances can be roughly 11.6 thousand kilometers between the device location and the egress point of the network traffic. And our data is slightly biased towards, we have an app, and it turns out, when we were looking at sort of these large mismatches, it turns out that a lot of users using our app were sort of checking to see if their VPN was working. So they were coming in for a different country, and they wanted to verify, am I egressing from the country that I'd like to egress from, even though my device geolocation is in a totally different country. So top mismatching geofeeds, we've got VPNs, again, CDNs and cloud services. Cellular providers like T-Mobile, where they make really heavy use of CGNets, as well as IP leasing brokers. And again, the same story from our RTT measurements, where you have this mismatch between the user and infrastructure geolocation. I'll cover now the 2 examples on adversarial geofeeds, on how you can use geofeeds to kind of trick maybe IP geolocation providers into thinking you're somewhere where you're not. So here is a guide. The URL is at the top, where they give you this is a very extensive blog post on how to get your IP subnet range to a geolocation that you want. And so they're sort of telling you, here are the instructions. You make a good case study, or you make a good argument, send it out, and ask for corrections, and eventually it'll show up. And I think since this blog post has been published, I think a lot of geo providers have safeguards to kind of prevent this from happening. This was earlier in the slide, and so if you notice, there was a huge uptick in IPv6 prefixes being covered by Geofeed entries, and it turns out that this adversarial Geofeed has 101,000 prefixes mapping to 249 countries. So you can see here, these /64s are going to Antarctica, which is probably not actually the case, and these entries here are pointing to North Korea, which again is probably not very likely. As earlier mentioned, there was an IAB workshop on IP address geolocation in December 2025, and so we were discussing and trying to figure out, okay, what can we do with geofeeds? How can we update the geofeed format? So some of the things that were discussed was, maybe specifying the validity period, or a TTL, to kind of show, hey, this is only valid from up until this date, right? So the example used in RFC 8805, you might have an end date for the IETF meeting, and at that point, you shouldn't consume that old geofeed anymore. Location identifiers, there's lots of hiccups and typos that can happen when you're adding location identifiers. So should we use something different, like an H3 identifier, like a hex cell that sort of is unambiguous as to where that location is, instead of having to parse location strings? It's possible. It sounds like that there might be a future IETF working group with a lot of stakeholders, and so we'll see what happens there. Another thing is the mechanisms for validation and feedback to operators. So there's a couple links here to some software and websites where you could test your geofeed, see it's valid, or and the previous speaker also had some software that you can use to validate your geofeed. And similarly, you could also validate on IP geolocation provider websites. They'll provide validators there where you can upload your geofeed and see is it valid or not. Options for public and private geofeed hosting. So currently, a lot of the stuff is manual corrections and updates. At IPinfo, we get some private geofeeds because it's sometimes a non-trivial cost, both in terms of maybe monetary and labor to actually maintain a geofeed. So how what's the best way to host these geofeeds? Should it be hosted by the RIRs? Should there be some sort of central repository for all these geofeeds rather than grabbing them from GitHub or other places? So if you're interested in working with us to help improve the geofeed or geolocation in general, please reach out to me. Come find me at the rest of Nanog, or feel free to send us email. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for the presentation. Do we have questions in the room? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Yes, this is Jack from ByteDance again. Yeah. So you mentioned the pin. So what's the smallest subnet do you pin? 24 or like a 20/24 or 24 subnet? So you pin each IP or just select some of IP address from the /24? How do you pin?
Yeah, so I think in general, for IPv4, we'll ping. We try to ping all the addresses. So not just a representative of each /24, but we try to conduct a census of all the IP addresses in the IPv4 space. With IPv6, it's obviously impossible to ping every single IP address. So we have a hit list that is being generated by a university, along with data that we collect, and we have a repository of IPv6 addresses that we ping and get measurements from.
What if there's no reply by the SMP? Some IP they do not reply. Just
yeah, that's definitely a huge problem, right? If you're behind the NAT, if you're behind CGNAT, or if you've firewalled us off, or you're not responsive, then we don't have that RTT information. So we can do several things, right? We don't just rely on RTT measurements to geolocate IPs, but we can take into account other different metadata, neighboring IPs, and so on to kind of to fill in the gaps.
use the trace route to see the path.
We do use trace routes, yes.
So one way for heuristic, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Good afternoon, Tom Beecher from Yahoo. I've been debating one of your colleagues, I'm sure you've heard on the mailing list about some of this in the last few weeks, so I don't want to put you fully on the spot for some of his comments, but
I've heard of it, but I've been on leave, so I've actually haven't been keeping track of what's going on. So
it hasn't been an adversarial conversation. It's been interesting and very respectful, so no concerns there. But sorry to put you a little bit on the spot for things he said. So multiple occasions, his comments there in some of your public documentation does state that when an ASN publishes a geofeed and your data comes up with a different conclusion, you guys will ignore the geofeed and present your calculation as authoritative. I guess part A, is that correct? I don't want to put words that's what he said a few times. I don't want to ask the second question if that's an incorrect assumption. So is that actually correct? That's your methodology, that you will ignore the geofeed if your calculation comes up with a different answer?
So off the top of my head, and I'll have to get back to you with a more authoritative answer, the geofeed entry, we take that into account when trying to decide the geolocation information of a particular IP address. So it's not completely discounted if our measurements are saying something otherwise, right? But it's all factored in to a decision tree of sorts to decide, okay, where does this IP address live, right? And it's not saying that, oh, the geofeed is completely wrong and therefore, the IP, we're going to go with what we've measured, but we take everything into account before making a final decision. So I think some of that nuance is lost when you look at our website and you plug in an IP address and it says, oh, this is where the information is, but we're taking into account all sorts of data sources before we make a decision.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, to not belabor the point and monopolize the mic, that can create a lot of problems for really additional costs for example, an ISP that their users happen to be using a site that happens to use your data. If there's an inaccuracy here, that ISP has to incur the cost of the support for the question from the users. They've got to diagnose it. They've got to work with you guys to correct it. And not to be blunt about it, but I will, you guys are the one profiting off that data, not them, right? So I think just as a point of, I'm not going to, your algorithm is what it is, but just, I think keep that into account with your guys' work, that creating that extra cost can be problematic for a lot, especially smaller providers. I'll leave you with something positive. I'll skip the other part, but your measurement methodology, very good. We've been doing a lot of this internally with our own users and services for years, and that approach is very good. I think there's definitely some concerns, so we could talk separately if you'd like to about it. But
sure, would love to follow up with you on that. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Rena, and actually, what he was saying is part of why what I was going to ask. So in a previous job, I worked for an ISP, and unfortunately, our CEO bought a big block of IPs from China. which, as you can imagine, wasted a lot of my time. Um, one of the first things that I did was make a Geofeed and give it to everybody that I could think of, and then still I can see that they're still answering tickets about things that are blocked. And it's the long tail of data that doesn't get updated. But even before that, like based on what you're saying, like you would pick up the Geofeed, and you would also see based on the latency that it would be in the correct location. But in cases where it's not, I mean, my position has always been IPs are not a good way of determining where something is physically located. And so I'm curious, like um, how you kind of justify like using, and not to say like your business shouldn't exist, right? I understand that there's a market for it, but like what's the justification behind saying like this number is a way of understanding where something is, even though it's really inaccurate a lot of the time?
So to answer one of
Sorry,
the
I know that's
questions,
kind of a hard question.
yeah, no worries. So I think there were several questions in there. I think one of them was about the reactivity, which I think is about the reactivity. And so this is obviously an interesting problem. If I can get back, there we go. So the second to right hand column is the reactivity of the when a geofeed is being processed and when it shows up in the results. I mean, not necessarily when it shows up in the results, but how often it's processed. And so this is an ongoing problem, right? Where IPs are being leased and moved, and when Geofeed is updated, and so an update to the Geofeed format, for example, would help us with understanding, okay, what's the TTL? When should we refresh our Geofeeds? Is there a validity period that I think would help with that? I think the other aspect of I think your other question about should IPs should IP geolocation exist? I don't have an answer for that. I think that's something that was discussed at the IAB workshop, and so I would encourage you to participate in that if you haven't already, and maybe pose those questions to the broader community. And I think your last question was about are our measurements, if our measurements are inaccurate, why are we using them? And I think I've shown that.
It's not so much about your measurements specifically. It's just that, like, given the amount of inaccuracy in the data, it's frustrating as an operator to really be powerless in that situation, because we're doing the thing that we're supposed to do. We're publishing in Geofeed. We're reaching out to providers to say, hey, please use this Geofeed. And our customers are complaining to us because they can't access other services via our service, and we have to reach out to websites that we have no business with, and that's because of really inaccurate but like insufficiently accurate for production use, in my opinion, services like is IPinfo and whatever else.
Yeah, so so I think to answer one of your questions, this really needs to have. I think this shows there's a problem where we don't have ways to communicate with operators and exchange data and share data and so on. And so I think what we're trying to do is and partly why we're here is to reach out to operators and so on. And how can we work together to provide the best data for everybody, whether that's in exchange with just us or with the broader community, or some way of having some sort of standard or some central repository where we can have geofeeds and have that be the authoritative source, right? Because right now it's sort of ad hoc, where you're reaching out to a bunch of different endpoints to find sort of this ground truth information. So is there a better way of doing that? And I'd love to work with you to get there.
Thank you.
Hi, Marcus Jackson, Amazon Web Services. I had a quick question about one of your slides, and I think should have the same thing, sort of talking about IPs for which there is no geolocation information.
Sure.
I get that you guys are saying, okay, that's a way to say there is no geolocation information. What do you actually pass on to your customers in that regard? Like, are you giving them a nothing? Are you falling back on RIR metadata? Like, what's the actual process behind that?
So I'll have to look exactly. I'm actually not sure. I don't have off the top of my head how many subnets in Geofeeds explicitly say they have no geolocation information. So at that point, I'm not quite sure.
And I guess the root of the question is there a hidden, like, if I have a block that is being advertised and let's say it's being, anycast in some way, and so there's not one specific location,
Sure.
is that a good way to do that? Because there's nothing in the current spec that lets me say like, yeah, this is anycast. So is that a way to do that, or is it just sort of completeness? Does it do anything to defend my space against you guys taking corrections from other people? Like, I'm trying to understand why would I do that?
Yeah, that's the great point. So anycast is obviously a huge one. So I think that would be a good way to signal that, hey, this is an anycasted subnet, so there is no geolocation information. And in our data and what we respond, we have an anycast tag that will say, hey, this IP address is anycasted, so you shouldn't take the location information. So I think at some point in the future, I think one of the interesting things is, could we provide, hey, these are the anycast locations for these, particular IP addresses. But for now, I think, maybe to answer your question, yeah, that's there's nothing in the Geofeed spec that says, oh, this is anycast or not, right? That's one of the sort of limitations of the Geofeed spec. But in the API or in our API and the data that we provide to everybody, we have an anycast tag that will say it's anycast.
I guess I'm more looking for a way for that and other IP types, like, is this a proxy, whatever. Like, I would love to have a way to, as a, the expert on these IPs, to provide you guys with better information to make better decisions, as opposed to having to wait for you guys to maybe infer what's going on, or to our colleague's point, like maybe not get it right and cause problems for us that we could have fixed by presenting the information up front.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, let's talk offline and let's try to figure out how we can exchange data with each other. So that'd be great.
Hey, I'm Joff from SF Mix, and my question is, how is the best way to engage you? I share a lot of similar frustrations with trying to update geolocation information with various providers, and despite publishing it, not really getting traction on getting that updated. My question is, I've kind of just guessed on email addresses to try and contact you guys in the past, and I think your point is great that like there's not really a good open line of communication from network operators and information providers to just share and collaborate. So my question is, how can we best get in touch?
Yeah, so I think on almost every geolocation provider website, I won't just speak for IPinfo, there is a contact form where you can say, hey, these are Geofeed corrections, or here's a publication to a Geofeed that might not be in RDAP, but is on GitHub or on Google Drive even, right? And so if we are not responsive or being very communicative, then I apologize. But from my understanding, I feel like we're pretty responsive, and so if we're not, then that's definitely something that we need to work on. So please, I have.
I assume you guys want the info too. So yeah, I just have maybe.
Yes, absolutely. So please reach out. Here, my email is here. The research team, and if you're not getting a response, please feel free to contact me, and I'll try to redirect you to the right people. So
that's fair.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, Caitlin, currently unaffiliated. I was a part of the IAB workshop as well in December, so I just wanted to add one thing in response about the Anycast and sort of the locations that haven't been published. One of the conversations that came out of that I wanted to address to you in the room in general was if there is to be a new Geofeed standard published, one of the topics was, should we include something that is specifically, we are intentionally leaving this this location blank? And then also, is there a way to signal like actual like advertising type so that you could signal like Anycast? So I just wanted to point that out to the room at large.
Awesome, thank you.
Jeff Houston, APNIC. I also was at that IAB geolocation workshop, and I must admit, I sort of have this air of unreality. We ran out of V4 addresses over a decade ago, and our solution wasn't everyone jumps to V6. Our solution was to blur the semantics of V4 addresses. We share them. We just grab them out of a CGNAT. We use them for a small amount of time and we send it off elsewhere. V4 addresses in particular, and increasingly now V6, don't matter. It's a name-based network, which is fine. Clients are largely anonymous. In the rest of the networking field, services matter, end clients don't. Yet the DRM industry has come along and said, we need to locate V4 addresses, and V6 by the way, but we need to locate addresses. Don't you feel you're swimming upstream? Don't you feel that the rest of the industry has moved on and that we actually don't curate individual addresses with the care and attention we gave them, 3 decades ago, because they're so scarce, they just get shared, they just get traded around, and we don't look after them to the extent that you seem to infer that they are. What's the future of IP location from the address perspective? Tough question, I know.
Yeah.
But it gets right to the heart of this. You're taking this shortcut. I see your address, it's over there, which 20 years ago, I'd say wasn't a bad idea. But in today's world, to apply this to the entire globe, you sit there and go, wow, that's a rough assumption.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're at the end
Absolutely.
of this
But
session,
it
and
kind
that's
of-
a really big question to
It's kind of this counter commentary to, yes, you can do it. And in some cases, you can be quite good at that point in time. But generically, is this the right way of going about it? And that's a really big question. It's not to the geolocation providers, it's actually sideways to the DRM folk going, you've cottoned onto IP addresses, have you latched onto the wrong handle to solve your problem?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. So again, there will be a presentation from the IAB workshop about the IP geofeeds. So please stay tuned. Hopefully we can try to answer your big question there. Well, I said try to anyway. So thank you, Kevin, for the presentation.